He volunteered to restore a lighthouse shattered by the nor'easter, just a ruined tower at the edge of a dying town. Edward Hale, a 60-year-old veteran turned small-town realtor, thought he was simply repairing history, but when his loyal German shepherd, Bailey, uncovered a sealed water vault beneath the cliffs, they unearthed the proof of a century-old promise, and a corruption that had stolen the town's lifeline. What began as a quiet restoration became a fight for truth, a revival of faith, and a reminder that some lights never truly go out. Before we dive in, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The wind off the Maine coast carried the smell of salt and pine, a low hum that seeped into every loose window pane of Harbor's Rest. Edward Briggs stood beside his pickup, collar raised against the cold, eyes on the house that leaned toward the sea, as though listening for something that never returned. It was a 2-story wooden structure, with gray planks scoured by decades of storms, a roof that sagged at the middle, and shutters that clapped weakly like tired hands. To everyone else, it was a ruin. To Edward, it was a pulse waiting to be found. At 61, he still carried himself like a man trained to move toward danger. His shoulders, though narrowed by age, bore the ghost of a harness strap. Before he became a real estate agent, he had been captain of a USAR unit, Urban Search and Rescue, the kind of man who crawled through burning rafters with only instinct and prayer. The job had carved him hollow in places, especially after the blizzard fire of '08, when a roof collapsed before his eyes. 3 lives saved, 1 lost. A boy named Adam with freckles and a soot-streaked cheek. The boy's mother had thanked him, and he had wished she hadn't. Bailey nudged his hand now, the German shepherd's amber eyes steady and knowing. 6 years old, thick-coated, right ear slightly torn from old field work. Bailey had served beside him in the rescue unit until retirement, and though the dog's muzzle was graying, his posture remained proud. Whenever the wind whistled like sirens, Bailey would press his chin onto Edward's knee, a quiet vow that neither of them would run from ghosts. "Looks like home, old boy," Edward murmured. Bailey answered with a low breath, almost approval. Inside the county hall, the winter auction buzzed with murmured skepticism. Locals whispered about the Mercer House, the last standing structure from the town's maritime boom, abandoned after the lighthouse decommissioned. The starting bid, "$20,000 none. You'll be buying yourself a seagull roost," one man chuckled. Edward lifted his hand anyway. A brief silence, a gavel's crack. Sold. The laughter followed him out like gull cries, but he didn't mind. He'd learned long ago that the bravest rescues were never in the spotlight. That afternoon he drove down Harbor Road, where the pines thinned and the gray gull lighthouse rose on a cliff like a finger pointing to heaven. The house sat opposite, on a slope of yellowed grass. As Edward stepped out, the wind pressed against his coat and carried the faint clang of an old wind chime hanging from the porch. He paused at the sound. It had the same pitch as the metal bell once tied to his rescue truck mirror, the one that rang whenever the station doors opened for a call. He stood there longer than he meant to. At dusk, he stopped by the post office bookstore, a narrow brick place run by Lila Merritt. She was 59, a widow with silver-streaked brown hair pinned in a loose bun, and eyes the color of river, stones after rain. She moved with a careful grace, as though the world were made of glass she didn't wish to break. When she smiled, lines fanned from the corners of her eyes like wings. "Evening, Ed," she said, sorting envelopes into pigeonholes. "Heard you bought the Mercer place. Brave or foolish?" "Bit of both," he replied, removing his cap. "Thought I'd fix it up. Maybe make a rest stop for travelers once the highway project's done." "That house hasn't had a light in its window since I was a girl," she mused. "They say the sea took the last owner's husband. Some nights you can still hear her calling." "Ghost stories sell better than real estate these days," he said. Lila laughed, the sound gentle as a tide against sand. "Then you'll need this." She reached behind the counter and handed him a small thermos wrapped in a tea towel. "Peppermint and honey for your first night there. And if you do meet the lady of the house, tell her I'm still waiting for my library book back." He grinned, tipping the thermos in salute. "If she appears, I'll make sure she pays the late fee." When he left, the dusk had turned violet. Streetlights flickered on one by one, their reflections trembling on puddles. He drove toward the cliff road, headlights catching the white flash of waves. Bailey stood in the truck bed, ears high, nose tilted toward the salt air. The dog's silhouette against the fading sky looked like something carved from loyalty itself. At the house, the porch groaned beneath his boots. He turned the brass doorknob. It moved stiffly, like an old joint, and pushed. The smell of dust and cedar filled his lungs. Inside, the place was larger than it seemed. A wide living room with boarded windows, a fireplace choked with ash, and photographs scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. One showed a man in a raincoat standing by the lighthouse, hand raised in farewell. Another, a woman in a white dress holding a lantern. He pocketed it without thinking. The wind outside strengthened, rattling the shutters until they slammed. Bailey barked once, sharp and alert. Edward turned, flashlight beam sweeping across the hallway. Something metallic clinked near the kitchen, a sound too steady for the wind. He stepped closer, hand instinctively reaching for the old rescue knife he kept at his belt. The beam landed on a rusty hook swinging from the ceiling, a chain dangling a few inches above the floor. Nothing more. He let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Just the wind," he whispered, patting Bailey's neck. But the dog didn't relax. His ears stayed forward, muscles tight. Then the generator in the truck clicked off outside, leaving the house in a silence so complete Edward could hear the sea breathing against the cliff. He set his gear by the hearth, lit a lantern, and sat with the thermos Lila had given him. The tea was still warm, sweet, the scent curling like memory. He thought of his old crew, their laughter in the truck, the smoke-blackened helmets lined on the wall. He missed them, and the purpose that burned cleaner than any flame. Selling houses was quiet work, maybe too quiet for a man who used to chase sirens. Bailey shifted suddenly, low growl vibrating through the floorboards. Edward followed his gaze toward the window facing the sea. Through the grime-streaked glass he saw the lighthouse tower, dark and lifeless as it had been for years. But just then, for the briefest flicker, a light glowed behind the lantern room glass, a soft, golden pulse that shouldn't have been possible since the wiring was stripped decades ago. He blinked. The light was gone. Edward rose slowly, lantern in hand. "You saw that too, didn't you?" he murmured. Bailey's tail was rigid, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind outside began to howl again, high and thin, carrying what might have been a woman's voice, or just the sea playing tricks on old ears. Edward stepped onto the porch, cold biting through his sleeves. Across the cove, the lighthouse stood in silence. And then, from somewhere inside the house behind him, came the distinct creak of a floorboard. A footstep, deliberate. Bailey turned, growling low. Edward's lantern flame trembled. "Hello?" he called into the dark hall. No answer, only the soft, rhythmic dripping of water from the kitchen sink he hadn't turned on. He took a single step inside. The wind slammed the door shut behind him. The lantern flickered once and went out. Morning came thin and glassy over Harbor's Rest, the kind of pale main light that makes everything look like it's been rinsed in salt. Edward Briggs woke to the old house breathing around him, timbers ticking, a far-off drip, the faint metallic tremor of a nail somewhere remembering storms, while Bailey, his 6-year-old German shepherd, with a broad chest and a nicked right ear, lifted his head from the cot and watched his face as if reading the weather there. The lantern he'd dropped when the wind slammed the door in the night lay cold beside the hearth, and the peppermint trace of Lila Merritt's tea ghosted the room. Edward sat up slow, joints registering the years and the rescues, and told himself the footstep he'd heard had been the house settling, though the part of him that had once crawled into burning stairwells did not accept easy comfort. He fed the stove a few thin splits, touched the old yellow rescue lamp hanging from a nail like a superstition, and began to do the only thing that quieted his thoughts. Work the scene like a search. Survey, isolate hazards, confirm egress, then clear. He ran a gloved hand along joists, checked the cutoffs he'd shut last night, then moved toward the kitchen where the smell changed from cedar dust to iron and damp plaster. Bailey went ahead in that economical trot that had saved both of them more than once, tail level, nostrils shivering on invisible currents. The back wall was skinned in corrugated tin, likely a Depression-era add-on. When Edward rapped it with his knuckles, the sound came back hollow, not the honest thunk of wood, but a drum. He marked a seam with chalk, shouldered the pry bar, and peeled the panel free with a shriek that skipped down his spine. Behind, in a shallow cavity, lay a wax-sealed tube the color of old honey, a leather logbook with frayed corners, and a cluster of brass keys tied with faded blue twine. He cut the wax, unrolled the map on the table, and saw Harbor's Rest drawn as if by a careful hand in 1890. Soundings in tiny numerals, a miniature lantern house inked on the headland, and a sigil east of the cliff where the lighthouse stood. Kirin Spring. The right to fresh water belongs to the community of Harbor's Rest in perpetuity. At the bottom, impressed into wax dark as molasses, a federal lighthouse seal no one had reason to forge back when water meant survival more than commerce. He opened the logbook and found neat slanted entries: wind force, lamp oil consumed, keeper initials, Simo Xitashols, and on the last filled page a sentence torn mid-flow, the ink dragged like a pulse that stuttered. If they come for the spring, hide the map. The water belongs to... He stared, feeling that old bright focus rise, the one that used to steady his hands when a roof started to talk. News rode the town before noon, the way gulls rode thermals. At Stella's Harbor Diner, the stainless counter polished by 50 years of elbows, coffee that could cauterize doubt, Stella, Hart herself, a round-shouldered woman in her late 60s, with forearms like dock rope and blue eyes that could forgive or forbid in a blink, poured him a mug and said the thing that made his jaw notch. Graham Sinclair's back with a marina dream and a bottling plant to save us, and he's telling the council he's purchased county rights to the fresh water under Grey Gull Cliff. Sinclair arrived on that line like a stage cue. Tall, late 50s, complexion the expensive bronze of men who holiday beneath awnings, hair black streaked with silver at the temples, jaw like a blueprint. No beard to soften any edge. He wore a navy overcoat cut to suggest both success and inevitability, and he smiled in a way that used teeth the way sailors use wind. He shook the mayor's hand, a thin, neat man named Alan Purdy, mid-40s with a careful part and the look of someone who files every memory, a touch too long, then turned to Edward with a warmness that slid off the surface. "Captain Briggs, isn't it? You took the Mercer place. I admire that kind of vision. My team would love to chat before you sink good money into a romantic ruin. The shoreline will be different in a year." Edward noticed Sinclair's cufflinks, tiny enamel goals, as he answered, "Different how?" Sinclair's smile brightened by a calculated watt. "Jobs, tourism, desal fresh hybrids, clean water in bottles with our town's name on them. We've secured the county claim to that spring and intend to steward it responsibly." Bailey, lying at Edward's boot, opened his amber eyes and tracked Sinclair's shoes with a look that said he understood pack lore better than contracts. Edward asked the question anyway. "You sure a spring that kept ships and kids alive gets sold with a signature?" Sinclair gave a chuckle as soft as velvet on a knife. "Everything's for sale if the paperwork's clean." When he left, the bell on Stella's door jingled its bright lie, and Edward watched the wake of him like he watched a flame find a new seam. He left cash by the mug, Stella didn't like tabs, and drove to the only place he trusted to hold the dead weight of history without dropping it, Lila's post office bookshop, a slim brick wedge of a building where the smell of paper and stamped ink seemed to hush the town's more foolish impulses. Lila Merritt, 59, silver-threaded brown hair pinned carelessly as though any minute she might let it fall, wore a slate cardigan with a tear neatly mended at the wrist, and moved with the quiet economy of those who have learned to listen before they speak. Sorrow had left its watermark in the tender lines around her mouth, not hard but honest. She greeted Edward with a look that took in the map tube and the logbook and then lifted to his face. "Whatever that is, it belongs on this counter." He spread the map in his hands, explained what the inscription said, showed her the torn sentence in the logbook. Lila fetched a brass lamp that made a small circle of dependable light and the town's archival keys, because of course she kept them, and led him to the back room where Harbor's Rest kept its paper bones. Ledgers bound in cracked leather, index cards typed 3 librarians ago, a box labeled Grey Gull, water in a schoolteacher's hand. The two of them bent over documents like conspirators in some quiet revolution. Bailey lay sphinx still by the door, raising his head each time the bell out front pinged, guarding this fragile human work. They found a maritime ledger from 1890, authorizing a freshwater reserve for navigational and municipal use, non-transferable in black letters older than any living quarrel. They found a typed memo from 1932 when the lighthouse well had been inspected, flow rate noted, water quality described as sweet. They found nothing that gave a county commissioner the right to sell what the lighthouse had stewarded in perpetuity. And when Lila, careful fingers laced, said, "Be careful, Ed. Men who think everything is for sale do not forgive the things that aren't," He felt the odd blend of dread and steadiness that used to move through him at the threshold of a burning door, that thrum that means your fear and your purpose have finally agreed. At dusk he took the old survey, the newly found map, a coil of rope, and the brass keys. The trail behind the Mercer place stitched the hill to the lighthouse like a scar. The air tasted of iron and tide. At the cliff's base, half swallowed by brush, an iron gate waited the way. Locked things wait for the correct hand. Bailey sniffed the hinges. The dog's manner turned all business, body low and sure. And Edward tried keys until one turned with the obedient click of a century-old promise. The service tunnel sloped into cool stone, salt sweat weeping from granite seams. Their light made a pale island that moved forward with them. Water sounded nearby, the slow, patient voice of a leak that doesn't care if men argue. The passage widened to a chamber where a narrow rill slid from a fissure into a clear pool, the color of old glass. He knelt and cupped it, tasted clean cold that shocked his teeth, and for a breath he saw children in dresses that tied at the back and men in wool watch caps filling buckets. And he thought, this is why someone wrote in perpetuity with their best pen. He spoke aloud because some truths require witnesses. This belongs to the town. Bailey's tail swept once in approval. That was when metal spoke behind them. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound of a man dragging a tool along stone to announce that he owned not just the tunnel, but the moment. Edward rose, turned, and set his shoulders as if a roof were testing itself. Graham Sinclair filled the entrance like a verdict. Collar up against the damp, hair neat in weather that musses honest men, eyes bright with the pleasure of arriving where someone else did first. A slim crowbar rested easy in his right hand like an accessory. "Mr. Briggs," he said in a voice coached to travel well in boardrooms and caves, "trespass is a poor beginning to neighborliness. Step away from my asset, and we can make you whole on that shack you bought." Edward's voice came back the way it always did when a trapped survivor started to panic. Level, paced, a rope you throw with tone. This spring fed keepers and townsfolk. It's written that the right is the town's. Your paperwork's lint and bravado. Sinclair's grin did not touch his pupils. I admire conviction in men who can afford it. Can you? Bailey moved sideways with the slow drift of a tide, putting his body between Sinclair and Edward without fuss, the way a capable partner makes a plan simple. Somewhere above them, the sea hit hard, and the stone translated it into a shiver under their boots. A thin crack wrote itself along the chamber wall, and a damp hiss became a thread of water, became a stream. Edward heard the calculus of weight and pressure in his bones, the way old musicians hear key changes. "Time to move," he said, already measuring the distance to the gate, already allocating hands, one for the rope bag, one for the ledger bag he had not brought but wished he had, one for the man who had no practice following orders in emergencies. But Sinclair stepped nearer the pool, as if possession were a kind of magic that could stop geology. "Walk away, Captain," he said almost kindly. "You don't want to be on the wrong side of a tide." The pool surged at the word, as if offended, and a fist-sized stone dropped from the ceiling into the water with a sound like a gavel. The lantern Edward had set on a ledge at the entrance guttered at the splash, flared, then dimmed to a sullen eye. Bailey barked once, sharp, commanding, a field cue that meant now, and the dog spun, herding both men toward the incline. Sinclair planted his feet, crowbar lifting half an inch. For a heartbeat, Edward saw two futures, the petty one, where men argued titles while the cold convinced their knees, and the other where one man remembered what it meant to get everyone out alive. He reached, grabbed Sinclair's coat at the lapel, and hauled with that compact strength age gives to those who never stopped lifting. "Move," he said, no extra words. And for once Sinclair obeyed the voice of someone who knew collapse better than contracts. The pool bloomed over its stone lip, cold up to the ankles, then shins. The lantern's flame made one last small, stubborn halo against the dark. Edward felt the rope bag hit his hip, felt Bailey brush his calf like a metronome of urgency, felt the tunnel tilt toward night. He turned his head once to mark the way back, to memorize the seam, the fissure, the proof. And in that instant the lantern winked, a gold coin in a thief's hand, then went black as a held breath. By morning the tide had receded, leaving seaweed curled like question marks along the shore. Edward Briggs and Bailey had made it out of the service tunnel soaked, breathless, and carrying the image of a drowning lantern that still burned behind his eyelids. Sinclair had vanished into the dark before Edward could see where he'd gone, maybe back through another shaft, maybe carried out by his own fear. The ocean had gone quiet again by dawn, too quiet, as if it had seen enough and closed its mouth. Edward drove into town with his wet boots wrapped in a tarp, stopping only long enough at home to change and pour strong coffee. His reflection in the window looked older than 61, gray hair flattened by seawater, eyes hollowed from a night spent fighting both man and memory. Bailey, sprawled on the floor, lifted his head every time Edward moved. "We're not done," Edward said softly, brushing the dog's flank. "Not yet." The day stayed cold but clear, Harbor's Rest in its winter habit, gray gulls tracing circles above the wharf, store windows fogged by heaters, locals hurrying between errands with collars turned up. Edward's office sat 2 doors down from the bait shop, a modest building with blue trim and a brass bell that rang politely when someone entered. By late afternoon, that bell rang too politely. Graham Sinclair stood in the doorway, the kind of presence that made rooms smaller. His navy blue suit looked custom-tailored for intimidation, shoes polished enough to reflect the gulls outside. A silk pocket square the color of bone peeked from his jacket, and his smile, barely there, cut sharp against the winter light. "Mr. Briggs," Sinclair said smoothly, stepping in without invitation. "Thought we might talk before things turn litigious." Edward leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "If this is about trespassing, I should be the one calling the sheriff." Sinclair chuckled, setting his leather briefcase on the desk. "No need for theatrics. I came with a more civilized proposition." He opened the case with a crisp click, slid out a check, and placed it gently on the desk. The numbers stared up. $150,000, with all the smug finality of ink that believed itself permanent. "Buyout," Sinclair said. "You sell me the Mercer property, all structures, fixtures, and any associated documentation, historical or otherwise. You walk away with more money than that shack will ever see." Edward stared at the check. His heartbeat slowed, not from surprise but from recognition. There had been offers like this before, different uniforms, same eyes. "You don't want the house," he said finally. "You want what's under it." "Let's not moralize business," Sinclair replied, voice velvet but eyes like slate. "You're a practical man. You know opportunity when it knocks." Edward took the check and turned it over once, then slid it back across the desk. "There's a rule from my old job," he said quietly. "You don't leave your team behind. This town is my team now. I'm not selling what keeps it alive." For a moment, silence balanced like a blade between them. Then Sinclair smiled, a thin, surgical thing. "You're a sentimentalist, Briggs. That's a fine quality in a firefighter, a poor one in real estate. Nostalgia doesn't pay taxes." Edward stood. "Neither does arrogance." The businessman's gaze flicked toward Bailey, who was watching from his rug by the door, amber eyes steady and unreadable. "Beautiful animal," Sinclair murmured, as if noting an asset. Then he lifted the check and tucked it back into his briefcase. "Think about it. You're not as young as you used to be, and I'd hate to see history go up in smoke." He left the words hanging like smoke themselves, then turned and walked out. The brass bell chimed after him, a small, useless protest. That night, the sky over Harbor's Rest turned the color of pewter. Edward sat at the kitchen table of the old wooden house, repairing a cracked window pane, Bailey's tail thumping lazily nearby. The air smelled faintly of salt and kerosene from the lantern. Outside, it gnawed at the cliffs with slow patience. He couldn't shake the image of Sinclair's face under the tunnel's trembling light, the calm of a man convinced the world owed him its yield. People like that didn't bluff. They built and burned in the same breath. Bailey's head snapped up before Edward heard it, a faint clink of metal outside, near the porch. The dog rose, hackles lifting, a low rumble in his chest. Edward reached for the flashlight, easing it toward the window. The beam caught only mist and pine branches bending in the wind. Still, the sense of wrongness clung. He turned in for the night, though sleep stayed shallow, the kind filled with half-heard alarms. Sometime past midnight, Bailey growled again, deeper this time, urgent. Edward was on his feet before the thought caught up. The smell hit him next, faint but sharp, oil and sulfur mixed. By the time he reached the front door, Bailey had already lunged toward the porch. A figure in dark clothing scrambled away toward the tree line, slipping on the wet grass. Bailey's bark split the night, fierce and disciplined, not wild. The intruder ran faster, vanishing into the fog, Edward swept his flashlight over the porch steps. Near the baseboard lay a bundle of rags, dark and wet. He crouched and sniffed. Kerosene. A slow-burn fuse soaked through, but not yet lit. His chest went cold. They tried to torch it, he whispered. He tossed the bundle into a metal bucket, dumped seawater from an old jug over it, watching the oily slick swirl and die. Bailey stood beside him, fur bristled, eyes still fixed toward the woods. "Good boy," Edward said softly, rubbing the dog's neck. "You just saved us." He waited another hour on the porch, listening for footsteps that didn't return, only the sound of distant surf and the metallic ring of the wind chime by the door, the same tone he had once heard on the rescue truck mirror. Memory came fast and sharp. A burning warehouse, the rookie he'd pulled out seconds before the backdraft, the promise he'd made then, to never ignore the small warnings. He felt the same pulse now, old and clear as command. By dawn, the evidence was gone, the footprints washed by drizzle, the smell of oil replaced by clean sea wind. But the unease stayed. He called Sheriff Amos Dyer, a broad man in his late 50s, with a square jaw, thinning blonde hair, and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had seen too much and trusted little. Amos had been in Desert Storm back in the day, a fact he never bragged about but carried in the quiet way he looked at chaos, measuring its shape. "Someone tried to light your porch," Amos said after checking the scene. "Likely kids, or maybe someone meaning to scare." "Kids don't bring kerosene in industrial rags," Edward said. Amos rubbed his chin. "You think Sinclair? I think whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing." The sheriff looked out toward the water, eyes narrowing against the sun glare. "I'll send a patrol by tonight, but Briggs—" He turned back, voice softer. "Men like Sinclair don't get their hands dirty. They just sign the checks." After Amos left, Edward sat in his truck, the world turning slow around him. Across the bay, the lighthouse stood dark against the sky, and in its shadow something flickered. A glint of metal, maybe glass, just for an instant, like the reflection of binoculars catching light. He blinked, and it was gone. Bailey whined, restless, pawing at the window. Edward started the engine, heart already ahead of him. The long shadow of Sinclair stretched across the town now, and somewhere beneath it, the truth waited, like the spring itself, buried but alive. Morning came thin and cold, draping Harbor's Rest in a fog so pale it looked carved from milk. Edward Briggs drove up the winding road toward the lighthouse, the truck rattling over frost-cracked asphalt. Bailey rode in the passenger seat, head out of the window, ears flicking to the rhythm of the surf below. The salt air held a faint metallic bite, the kind that told fishermen bad weather was brewing. Lila waited at the keeper's house, bundled in a wool coat the color of sea smoke. She was in her early 60s, tall and slender, with silver-gray hair tied in a low knot and lines around her eyes that hinted at laughter long ago. Her hands, strong but thin, carried the permanence of work. Somehow, someone who had tied nets, mended sails, and buried memories in the same tide. She'd brought tea in an old thermos, the chipped blue one that had belonged to her husband. "Ready?" she asked, as Edward climbed out. "As ready as we'll ever be," he said, forcing a small grin. They spread the artifacts on the kitchen table, the waxed map tube, the brass keys, and the weathered logbook bound in cracked leather. Edward opened the log first, the paper sighed beneath his fingertips. The ink had faded into brown rivers, but the words still spoke clear enough. Nathaniel Crow, keeper of Grey Gull Light, 1893. Crow. The name alone seemed to echo in the beams above them. He'd been the lighthouse keeper for nearly 20 years, one of those stoic men who live between storm and solitude. Edward imagined him broad-shouldered, sun-leathered, hands permanently smelling of lamp oil. Lila traced a finger down the page, murmuring the words. "He writes about the spring," she said softly. "Says he drew water from the cavern below the tower during the dry season. Gave it to the ships and the village children." "Listen to this," Edward added, flipping further. Mentions his wife, Martha Crow. Says she called the water the breath of the sea's mercy. Lila's eyes warmed at the phrase. That's something a woman would write. They found more than records inside the tube. There were letters, wrapped in oiled paper, the ink still legible in places. Each was addressed, "To my son, if he ever sees the light again." None were sent. Edward read one aloud, his voice low, reverent. "The storm took our child's breath, but left the sea humming. I dip his blanket in the spring each night. It smells of salt and forgiveness. If the water can remember, then perhaps it forgives us too." The words sank into the silence like stones in deep water. Lila stared at the page, lips trembling slightly. Her son died of whooping cough, she whispered. I know what it's like to hate the ocean and miss it in the same breath. Edward looked up. Your husband? She nodded once. Jonah. He was a fisherman. The storm of 16, 7 years now. The Coast Guard found his boat 3 miles east of the shoal, but not him. For a while, I couldn't stand the sound of the waves. Then I realized the only thing that kept me upright was still listening to them. Edward didn't speak for a while. He thought of the fires he'd walked into during his rescue years, the screams, the silence after. Loss didn't vanish. It just changed shape. Maybe this, he said finally, tapping the letters, isn't just about water rights. Maybe it's about keeping what people like them built. Bailey barked softly near the door, as if seconding the thought. Later that afternoon, they went to the county archives, a squat brick building beside the post office, warmed by the scent of coffee and aging paper. The clerk, Mrs. Janine Rowe, was a plump woman in her late 50s, with glasses perched halfway down her nose and a cardigan that had seen better Christmases. She was kind, but her voice carried the clipped rhythm of someone who didn't like complications. Edward handed her the deed records. We're trying to verify a land and water grant tied to the Lighthouse, dated between 1890 and 1903. She clicked through a terminal that hummed faintly. Let's see. Oh, we don't have the originals, just digital reproductions. The originals were, well, misplaced during the 2014 system migration. Edward frowned. Misplaced? She hesitated. Or purged. The file you're asking about shows a reassignment of mineral and water rights to... She squinted. Blue Horizon Holdings. Lila's brows drew together. That's Sinclair's subsidiary. Mrs. Rowe nodded absently. It's all above board, I'm sure. Signed by the district water registrar, dated 2019. Edward leaned closer. Who signed it? Her finger traced the signature line, lips mouthing the name. Thomas R. Greeley. Lila gasped softly. He retired 2 years before that date. He's in assisted living now. Mrs. Rowe looked up, unease flickering in her eyes. Then someone forged it. The three stood in silence until the clerk cleared her throat nervously. I probably shouldn't have said that, if you didn't hear it from me. Back in the truck, Edward exhaled slowly, watching fog creep along the windshield. Forgery. Sinclair's trying to fake ownership of the spring. Lila hugged her coat tighter. Then we'll need proof, the kind that can't be erased by a computer. He thought for a moment, then looked toward the cliffs. There's one place left, the old cistern under the lighthouse. Crow mentioned it in his notes. If there's any inscription or seal, it's down there. The climb that evening was steep, the light fading faster than expected. The tide was retreating, revealing barnacled stones slick with seaweed. Bailey trotted ahead, alert but calm, his breath visible in short clouds. They reached the arched brick structure at the base of the cliff, half buried by sand and ivy, its iron door mottled with rust. Edward brushed off the engraved plate above the arch. The letters were faint but legible. Gray Gull Reservoir, established 1891, property of Harbor's Rest Community. There it is, Lila whispered. The proof. Edward ran his fingers over the etching. If we can document this, we can stop Sinclair. He pulled a flashlight and camera from his bag, snapping photos of the engraving, the seal, and the surrounding foundation. But as he worked, Bailey's ears pricked up. The dog let out a low growl, hackles rising. What is it? Lila whispered. Edward turned, sweeping the flashlight across the path. Footprints, fresh ones, led down from the bluff above. At the far end of the beam, a figure lingered for a heartbeat. A tall man in a dark coat, face half hidden, watching. Then he disappeared into the fog. Sinclair's men, Edward muttered. They packed quickly and left, the weight of the discovery pressing against the night. When they reached town, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, soft, slow, almost tender. Lila paused on the street corner, hand resting briefly on Edward's sleeve. Do you ever think, she asked quietly, that the things we find are really the things that were waiting to be found? Edward looked at her, the snow reflecting in her gray eyes. Sometimes, he said, they find us first. Bailey shook himself beside them, scattering snow like salt. Somewhere out in the fog, a car engine started and then died. Edward turned toward the sound, jaw tightening. The battle for the spring had just begun. By dusk, the wind had already begun its slow rage. The nor'easter moved down the coast like a living creature, its howl rising through the gullies and pine valleys of Harbor's Rest. The lighthouse on Grey Gull Point vanished and reappeared behind sheets of rain, as if blinking through its own tears. Edward Briggs stood on his porch, cinching his weathered rescue harness, a relic from his old firefighting days. It was scuffed and salt-stained, but solid. Bailey, his 6-year-old German shepherd, waited by the door, wearing his bright orange SAR harness, the reflective strips catching every flash of lightning. The dog was alert yet calm, as if storms were just old colleagues returning to visit. The call had come from Lila barely an hour earlier. "The storm's shifting east," she'd said, her voice thin through static. "If it floods the lower trail tonight, we'll lose the entrance by morning. We have to get to that cistern before it's sealed for good." He could have said no, should have, but he knew there wouldn't be another chance. The storm would wash away more than footprints. It would erase history. When Lila arrived, she was already soaked through. She wore a heavy navy raincoat several sizes too large, the hood blown back to reveal her silver hair plastered against her face. In her eyes, brown flecked with gray, there was both fear and resolve. "If the sea wants someone tonight," she said softly, "I'll count every wave that tries to take them." Edward gave her a faint grin. "Then count backward for me." They set out toward Grey Gull Point in the pickup, headlights barely cutting through the horizontal rain. The wipers fought a losing battle, and each gust of wind rocked the truck like a restless hand. Bailey sat upright between them, nostrils twitching at every scent carried by the gale. When they reached the cliffs, the world had narrowed to motion, rain slashing sideways, waves detonating against rock, the beam of the lighthouse spinning like a wounded halo. The iron door to the lower vault was locked, thick with corrosion. Edward tried one of the brass keys from Crow's box, no luck. He tried another, smaller one shaped like an anchor, still nothing. The wind screamed through the railings above them, carrying a salt sting that burned their lips. Bailey suddenly stiffened, nose pressing against Edward's thigh. He pulled toward a narrow crevice to the left of the main door, half covered by a torn wire mesh. His bark came short, deliberate, 2 clipped bursts, the "found it" signal. Edward's pulse jumped. He's got something. He grabbed a crowbar from his pack, pried away the mesh while Lila held a waterproof lantern steady. The light quivered in her trembling hands, throwing shadows that shuddered across the wet stone. "Careful," she warned. Behind the mesh, a low tunnel opened into blackness. Water gushed in shallow rivulets along its floor, carrying pebbles like coins offered to the dark. Edward dropped to his knees and crawled in first, Bailey right behind him, Lila following last. The tunnel narrowed, then widened suddenly into a vaulted chamber, the lost cistern. Its ceiling glistened with mineral crystals, the walls slick with age. At the center stood an ancient basin carved of sandstone, overflowing with clear water that shimmered under the beam of Edward's flashlight. It wasn't seawater. It smelled faintly sweet, clean, alive. "God," whispered Lila, "it's still running." In one corner sat a chest, small but reinforced with iron bands, its lid sealed in pitch. Edward brushed away grime and found an embossed crest, U.S. Lighthouse Service, and the date 1892. He pried the seal open carefully. Inside lay a bundle of papers preserved in oilskin, a brass stamp, and a wooden ledger. Lila's breath caught as she read the heading. Charter of the Grey Gull Spring, Federal Lighthouse Division, ratified 1893. Beneath it, signatures and wax seals, including that of Nathaniel Crow himself. Edward turned a second document over. Community Endowment Deed, records of flow rates, signed by the Harbor Council. His eyes met hers. "This is it. Proof that the spring belongs to Harbor's Rest." Before she could answer, the light in her hand flickered, then died. The chamber plunged into thick darkness. Bailey growled, low, tense, warning. A shuffle of boots echoed from the entrance tunnel, then a faint orange glow. Firelight. A masked figure loomed at the mouth of the arch, rain dripping from his coat, gloved hand clutching a burning rag. "Move away from the chest," the man barked, voice rough and muffled. Edward saw the logo on the sleeve, Sinclair Marine Holdings. "You're trespassing," he said evenly, shifting his stance. The intruder threw the burning rag into the chamber. Flames licked across the damp floor, sputtering but spreading smoke fast. "We'll take it from here," the man hissed. "No heroes tonight." Before Edward could move, Bailey exploded forward, a blur of motion and fury. The German shepherd hit the man mid-stride, jaws clamping around his forearm. The torch fell, hissing out in the puddle. The intruder shouted, stumbling backward, trying to strike, but Bailey held firm, muscles rippling under his wet coat. Edward lunged, grappling for the attacker's other arm. A knife flashed briefly, slicing air. Edward caught the wrist, twisting until the blade clattered against the stone. Rain thundered outside, each gust pushing the tide higher into the cave mouth. "Edward!" Lila cried, pointing toward the entrance. A massive wave surged into the tunnel, filling the chamber ankle-deep, then knee-deep. The roar drowned all sound. "Get on the ledge!" Edward shouted. He shoved the chest onto a raised slab of rock and pulled Lila up after it. The next wave came harder, icy and merciless. Bailey still had hold of the intruder, who was half submerged, thrashing. "Bailey, take!" Edward yelled, uncoiling a rope from his harness. He threw it out. The dog released the man, turned, and clamped his jaws on the rope's knot. Edward pulled with everything left in him, hauling both Bailey and the gasping intruder onto the ledge just before the third wave slammed through. The water swirled around their legs, then slowly began to retreat. The only sounds were the hiss of rain through cracks in the rock and Bailey's heavy panting. The man lay coughing, his mask half torn away. He was younger than expected, maybe mid-30s, with a face gone pale from shock, dark hair plastered to his forehead, and a jagged scar cutting from temple to chin. "Who sent you?" Edward asked. The man spat seawater, eyes wild. "You already know." Outside, a new light cut through the storm, a sweeping red and blue glare. The Coast Guard's search beams pierced the fog, reflecting off the cliff walls. Lila had fired a flare just before the fight. Now the rescue team was closing in. Within minutes, the masked man was handcuffed by two officers, both wrapped in bright yellow slickers. One, Lieutenant Carla Hayes, a sturdy woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and an even shorter patience, gave Edward a curt nod. "We tracked your flare. Lucky we did. You're half a tide from getting sealed in here." Edward managed a weary smile. "Wouldn't be the first time I got stuck in a flood." Carla's expression softened. "Next time, leave the heroics to the young ones." Lila chuckled quietly, still trembling. "Trust me, Lieutenant, he's been trying to retire from heroics his whole life." As the officers led the man out, Bailey stood guard by the chest, soaked but unwavering, tail thumping once as Edward knelt beside him. "Good boy," he whispered, resting a hand on the dog's broad back. Bailey's amber eyes caught the reflection of the rescue lights, glowing fierce and alive. When they emerged from the tunnel, the storm was breaking. Rain still fell, but softer now, and the wind's fury had spent itself. The beam of Grey Gull Lighthouse turned slowly above them, steady and patient, as if it had been watching all along. Edward looked back at the dark mouth of the cave, and then at Lila. "We've got what we need," he said. "Now we just have to make it count." She nodded, exhaustion and hope mingling in her smile. "We will." And as Bailey trotted ahead through the shallow water, barking once into the dawn wind, it sounded not like warning, but like triumph. The storm had passed, leaving Harbor's Rest looking like a town that had exhaled after holding its breath too long. The streets still smelled of salt and damp wood, but the air was bright with a strange calm, as though the ocean itself was resting. Edward Briggs stood outside the county hall that morning, the wooden steps slick from dew, his old field jacket still carrying the faint scent of seawater. Bailey waited by his side, tail gently brushing the floor, his black and tan coat newly brushed, but still matted at the chest from the storm. He had earned every tangle. Inside, the hall was crowded. Fishermen in clean flannels, retired lighthouse workers, shop owners, and a few curious tourists who had stayed after the nor'easter. The walls were lined with old portraits of men who'd governed the county long before Harbor's Rest had running water. At the center of the long oak table sat the county commission, 5 members, led by Commissioner Ruth Delgado, a tall, dignified woman in her late 60s with iron-gray hair coiled in a bun, and sharp eyes that had once belonged to a public defender. She had a habit of clicking her pen when she thought, and by the time Edward entered, that sound had already become the room's heartbeat. Lila sat near the front row, wearing a simple dark green dress and a shawl over her shoulders. Her hands were clasped around a folder of documents, the letters of Martha Crowe. When Edward caught her eye, she gave a small nod, one that said both be careful and be brave. Across the room, Graham Sinclair stood with his attorney, Richard Voss, a slick man in his early 40s with a square jaw, sharp cheekbones, and an unsettling smile that looked practiced more than natural. His dark hair was parted with precision, and his charcoal suit looked like it had been ironed by fear itself. Voss had a reputation for turning gray ethics into silver profit. Commissioner Delgado began, voice firm but fair. This emergency session concerns the petition by Sinclair Marine Holdings regarding water rights to the Grey Gull Spring. Mr. Briggs, you've requested the floor. Proceed. Edward rose, walking to the table. The storm had left a thin scar on his cheek from a flying branch, and it caught the morning light like a quiet metal. He placed the old iron-bound chest onto the table, its hinges still rust-stained, and opened it slowly. Inside lay the relics of their long fight. The charter of 1893 bearing the official seal of the United States Lighthouse Service, the flow rate ledger in Nathaniel Crow's handwriting, and the community trust document confirming public ownership of the spring. The air seemed to tighten around the paper. These records, Edward said, his voice steady though his throat felt dry, were recovered from the original Grey Gull cistern during the nor'easter. They show that the spring was federally registered as a community resource, its water to be managed by the Harbor's Rest Township. The so-called transfer to Sinclair Marine Holdings, it's fraudulent, signed by a man who'd already retired from office. Gasps murmured through the room. Commissioner Delgado leaned forward. You can prove that, Mr. Briggs? He nodded toward Lila, who stood, smoothing her dress. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the calm of someone who had already lived through greater storms. I've cross-checked the registrar's retirement date with county payrolls. The signature on the 2019 document is not his, and I believe Mrs. Janine Rowe of the records office can confirm this discrepancy. From the back, Mrs. Rowe, small, nervous, clutching her purse like a life raft, rose and nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. I saw the files myself. The real ones were never digitized. The copies came later. I think someone deleted the originals. Sinclair's lawyer rose immediately, voice honeyed but sharp. Objection. None of these individuals are forensic experts. Their claims are anecdotal at best. What my client possesses is a certified document, legally binding. Commissioner Delgado's pen clicked once, twice. And yet, she said, it appears your certified document might be a forgery. Mr. Voss, unless you can produce the notary of record, I'd suggest you refrain from lecturing this commission on legality. Laughter rippled through the back row. Voss flushed slightly, then whispered furiously to Sinclair, whose face remained an impassive wall of confidence. Edward continued, These records are more than ink and paper. They're history, proof that this spring was meant to sustain the town, not enrich a corporation. He reached for the smaller bundle of letters and handed them to Lila. She stepped forward and faced the commission. These, she said, voice softer now, were written by Martha Crow, wife of the last lighthouse keeper. She wrote about drawing water from the spring to heal her child's illness, about sharing it with the fishermen and children of the village. She wrote, We are made of the same salt and the same mercy. When the water runs clear, so does the soul. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the waves outside seemed to pause. Then Lila added, A community doesn't survive on contracts and pipes alone. It survives on promises kept. And this spring, this promise was never theirs to sell. Commissioner Delgado's eyes glistened for a heartbeat before she looked back to the panel. Thank you, Mrs. Porter, she said, mistaking Lila's surname but too moved to care. The record will reflect your statement. Voss tried again, clutching a folder. Your Honor, even if these documents are authentic, the property deeds surrounding the spring fall under Sinclair's development rights. That includes access to the aquifer beneath. Edward met his gaze. You can't own the dirt, Mr. Voss. Doesn't mean you own the life beneath it. A ripple of applause broke out from the townspeople. Commissioner Delgado clicked her pen once, then nodded slowly. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this commission rules as follows. The Grey Gull Spring shall remain the protected property of Harbor's Rest. All associated transfer documents filed by Sinclair Marine Holdings are hereby nullified and referred to the district attorney for investigation into forgery and fraud. The applause this time was thunderous. Fishermen slapped one another's backs, the lighthouse retirees whistled, and Bailey barked once, a sharp, proud sound that made a few people laugh through tears. Sinclair rose, face pale but controlled. "You may have your quaint little victory," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "but you haven't stopped progress. The sea will still be here, and so will we." Edward looked at him evenly. "You're right about one thing," he said. "The sea stays, but it's on our side now." Sinclair hesitated, then turned and left, his lawyer following close behind. Later that afternoon, the old timber house by the dunes, once just a wrecked shell of salt-eaten boards, was chosen by the town as its new Grey Gull archive and safe haven station. Edward volunteered to oversee its restoration. The funding came partly from a disaster recovery grant, partly from donations collected by the townsfolk, who now saw him as something of a local legend. He oversaw the installation of a backup generator, a clean water filter connected directly to the spring, and a small reading room where children could come hear stories of the sea and its keepers. Lila agreed to run it, her gentle hands now turning pages instead of tying nets. Sometimes, as dusk fell, Edward would walk with her along the stone jetty where the sea met the quiet shore. They didn't speak much, words seemed unnecessary. The sound of the waves and Bailey's paws on wet stones said enough. Healing, he'd realized, wasn't loud. It was steady, like the pulse of the tide returning, again and again. And when the lighthouse's beam swept across them, the three shadows, man, woman, and dog, merged for a moment into one. Spring arrived gently, like a gull brushing its wing against a new sky. The gray frost that had gripped Harbor's Rest finally gave way to the scent of wet soil and blooming saltgrass. The town had begun to breathe again. The old lighthouse, Grey Gull Light, no longer guided ships, but every Saturday evening its lantern was lit anew, not as a beacon for sailors, but as a promise to the living. Edward Briggs stood on the stone path that led to the lighthouse, watching as volunteers carried buckets of clear spring water from the restored cistern. The water glimmered with faint gold in the late light. Children queued up with tin cups, filling them under the guidance of Mrs. Ada Finch, a retired teacher in her 70s with silver hair pinned beneath a straw hat. Her voice, still sharp despite age, carried across the yard. "Don't spill it, Thomas. That's not just water. That's history." She was the kind of woman who commanded obedience without cruelty, her presence a blend of authority and affection. Bailey trotted between the children, his tail wagging like a pendulum. His black and tan coat had fully recovered its sheen since the storm. Around his neck hung a small brass tag newly polished by Lila, engraved Honorary Guardian, Grey Gull Station. Every time the bell above the door rang, Bailey would make a slow patrol through the reading room, nuzzling the hands of visitors as if to ask whether they were well, then returning to lie across the entrance like a living gate of warmth. Inside the refurbished station, sunlight spilled across the oak floors. The smell of salt and old paper mingled with the faint sweetness of candle wax. Lila tended to the archive shelves, her hair loosely tied, eyes reflecting the kind of calm that came only after years of noise. She had found new rhythm here, cataloging letters, labeling artifacts, greeting visitors who came to see the miracle spring. To her surprise, she had become something of a local figure, spoken of with the same fondness as the lighthouse itself. That afternoon, a stranger arrived, a middle-aged man in a navy peacoat, tall but slightly stooped, his hair sandy blonde streaked with gray. His face was weather-worn, marked by lines of salt and sun, and his hands bore the roughness of someone who had known rope and deck. He introduced himself simply as Captain Henry Crow, a descendant of Nathaniel Crow, the original lighthouse keeper. His voice carried a gentle rasp, like the hush of wind through rigging. "My grandfather told me stories of this place," he said to Edward, removing his cap. "Said one day the light would go out, and when it came back, it'd be for a different kind of navigation." Edward shook his hand. "Then your grandfather was right. The light's back, but it leads hearts more than ships." Henry smiled faintly, eyes glancing toward the distant horizon. He'd have liked that. He donated a weathered leather logbook, its pages filled with tide, charts and notes written in old-fashioned script. "I found this in an attic trunk in Maine. It belongs here." Lila accepted it reverently, brushing dust from the cover. "We'll preserve it properly. The past deserves care, too." As dusk descended, the townsfolk gathered outside for the weekly lighting. Commissioner Ruth Delgado herself attended, her bun looser than usual, a rare smile creasing her face. Even Mrs. Rowe from the records office came, shyly carrying a tray of ginger cookies. Edward placed the brass key into the ignition of the restored lantern housing and turned it. A hum filled the air, and the lens caught the last traces of daylight before blooming into full gold. The crowd cheered softly, their faces lit by the gentle pulse of the beacon. The light stretched across the bay, painting a golden path on the darkening water. Somewhere, a gull cried, echoing the whistle of a long-departed ship. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Edward lingered by the railing. Lila joined him, her shawl fluttering in the ocean breeze. "You ever think," she asked quietly, "that maybe we don't save places, they save us?" He smiled, looking toward the beam sweeping across the sea. "I used to dream about that storm, the night everything went black. Couldn't sleep without hearing the wind screaming. But lately, the dream stopped. I think maybe it's because the light found its way back first." Lila placed her hand over his. "I thought I'd run out of seasons to start again," she said softly. Edward's smile deepened. Harbor's Rest only has 2 seasons anyway, the waiting and the returning. Behind them, Bailey gave a soft chuff, curling at their feet, head resting on his paws as though satisfied with the day's patrol. His amber eyes reflected the lantern's glow, twin sparks against the gathering dark. They watched together as night unfurled, a night no longer haunted but whole. The lighthouse beam circled, unhurried and eternal, brushing the waves like a benediction. On the shelf inside, the old charter lay beside Martha Crow's once unsent letters, now read aloud every Sunday afternoon to anyone who cared to listen. Children sat cross-legged as Lila's voice carried across the room, reading words written by a woman long gone but never forgotten. "We are of salt and mercy. The light endures because hearts remember." It was no longer about battles won or storms survived. It was about keeping promises, the kind that outlive the people who make them. And as the beacon turned once more, its light touched Edward's face, then the sea, then the quiet houses along the shore. Harbor's Rest, once a town of shadows, now stood bathed in gold. In that moment, Edward thought not of loss but of continuity, the tide that leaves yet always returns, the flame that dims but never dies. When the storms of life tear through our homes, our hearts, and the places we thought were safe, God never leaves us in the wreckage. He waits, sometimes in silence, until we're ready to see the light again. Edward didn't rebuild a lighthouse alone. He followed a whisper of grace, and through it found forgiveness, hope, and a reason to keep the light burning for others. Maybe that's the miracle we all forget. God doesn't always calm the storm, but He teaches us to build a light strong enough to stand through it. So, if this story touched your heart, share it. Maybe someone you love is waiting for their own light to return. Leave a comment below, tell us what you are praying for this week, and don't forget to subscribe. Together, we keep the light shining. May God bless you, and may His light guide you safely home.